In the final weeks of Bergen-Belsen, mothers were giving birth on bare floorboards in barracks crawling with typhus, and some of those babies died within minutes of being born. That part usually gets skipped. On April 15, 1945, British soldiers walked through the gates expecting to save lives. For thousands of children inside, the rescue came either too late, or in some of the cruelest cases, the rescue itself is what killed them. This is not part of the 1.5 million Jewish children historians at Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum say the Nazis murdered outright. This is the smaller, far less discussed group. Children who survived long enough to see the gates finally open and still never made it out alive. At Bergen-Belsen, the countdown to that moment had already started months before the British ever arrived. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen was holding many times more people than it was ever built for, swollen by Death March transports evacuated from camps closer to the collapsing front. Typhus tore through the barracks. Food and water had been cut off entirely in the camp's final weeks, and more than 18,000 prisoners died in March 1945 alone, the single worst month the camp ever saw. Survivor Renee Salt later recalled that people were collapsing and dying constantly all around her, while the water supplies stayed cut for days at a stretch. Among the roughly 50,000 people who died at Bergen-Belsen overall, two of the most famous victims were a teenager named Anne Frank and her older sister Margot, who both died of typhus in February or March 1945, only weeks before liberation. Survivor Anita Lasker-Wallfish later explained that Bergen-Belsen never needed gas chambers, since disease and starvation did the same job slowly, in plain view of everyone else still alive to watch. Anne and Margot were among the last children to die before the gates opened. Thousands more would not make it even that far. On April 15th, the 11th Armored Division reached Bergen-Belsen and found roughly 60,000 prisoners still alive, most of them seriously ill. Thousands of corpses lay unburied across the campgrounds because the SS had not bothered to bury them. A senior British officer inspecting the camp that first night counted roughly 28,000 women and 12,000 men still alive, most needing hospital care immediately, and estimated that at least 10,000 of them were going to die no matter what his medical teams did. He was not exaggerating. He was doing math that turned out to be almost exactly right, and a disproportionate share of that math was children. Weeks later, once the camp was finally empty, British troops burned every barrack to the ground to stop the typhus from spreading any further. But here's the part almost nobody expects. Soldiers who had just spent years fighting Nazis handed starving prisoners whatever food they had, out of pure instinct. And some of those prisoners died within minutes of the first bite. Their bodies had been starved for so long that ordinary food triggered a metabolic collapse doctors later named refeeding syndrome. One relief worker, Laurie Pettit, later described patients who were put on a rich diet, who began to recover and put on weight, and who then died suddenly anyway. British medical teams scrambled through one approach after another: bully beef rations first, then skimmed milk, then a rice and sugar mix originally developed for famine survivors in Bengal, before finally finding something the prisoners' systems could process safely. By the time they figured it out, hundreds had already died from the very meals meant to save them. Two United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration medical teams arrived within weeks to take charge of nutrition, one led by Arnold Michaeljohn and the other by Janet Vaughan. Before Belsen, refeeding syndrome had been almost a medical myth, something doctors had only read about rather than watched happen in front of them. 12 volunteer medical students came from each of several London hospitals, working punishing shifts to feed, clean, and triage tens of thousands of patients with almost no supplies, eventually helping cut the daily death rate from more than 500 a day at liberation to under 100 a day by mid-May. It was a grim irony nobody on either side had been prepared for. An army that had spent years trying to defeat these people's captors now had to relearn in real time how not to accidentally kill the survivors themselves. That improvement still meant thousands of deaths in between. Children were not spared from any of this. A girl named Sarah Moses spent her 7th birthday lying on the floor of Bergen-Belsen with death on every side of her. She was liberated 5 days later, one of the lucky ones. A boy named Tommy Reichenthal was 9 years old when his family was caught hiding from Nazi laws and deported to Belsen. He survived and spent much of the rest of his life as one of the few child survivors willing to describe in public what he had seen there. A 15-year-old Hungarian girl named Margit Buchhalter lied about her age the moment she stepped off the train at Auschwitz, claiming to be 18. And that single lie is the only reason she was not sent straight to the gas chambers alongside her parents. She survived Auschwitz with the number A23029 tattooed into her arm, then survived the death marches that brought her to Bergen-Belsen, and was liberated there at 16. A teenager named Eugene Black, a fit 16-year-old footballer before his deportation, was liberated, weighing barely 30 kilograms. By then, he had turned 17. And he discovered his entire family was gone, except for one brother. Other children were not as fortunate as any of them. The BBC's Richard Dimbleby, who entered the camp with the British that week, described newborns there so weakened by months of their mother's starvation that they were already dying within hours of being born. One witness described a mother begging a British soldier for milk for her baby, only for the soldier to discover the infant had already been dead for days. This was not an isolated horror story. It was the daily reality inside that camp for weeks after the war had technically already ended for it. Therefore, the official numbers tell their own story. Nearly 14,000 people who were alive when the British arrived died in the weeks that followed, despite round-the-clock care from Army doctors, the Red Cross, and those volunteer medical students. Children, already the most fragile prisoners in the entire camp system, were disproportionately represented in that number. The death toll at Bergen-Belsen did not stop on April 15th. It just changed who was responsible for it. For the children who did make it through that first brutal month, freedom still did not look like home. Most had no parents left to return to, and no country offering to take them in. So Bergen-Belsen, the same ground where so many of them had nearly died, reopened within weeks as a displaced persons camp, eventually housing more than 12,000 Jewish survivors at its peak and lasting until 1950, 5 years after liberation. A school for orphaned children opened there within 6 weeks of liberation, and by 1948, it had 340 pupils. The camp also became, strangely, a place of new life. In its first 2 years, more than 1,000 Jewish couples married there, and well over 1,000 Jewish children were born on the same ground where so many children had just died. The first twins born in the camp arrived on July 14, 1946. In 1947, residents of the camp staged demonstrations after the British intercepted a refugee ship called the Exodus and sent its passengers back into detention in Germany. A reminder that even 2 years after liberation, freedom was still something these survivors had to keep fighting for. Decades later, Yad Vashem built a children's memorial in Jerusalem, specifically because so many of the 1.5 million had no surviving relative left to say their names out loud. The room is lit by a single candle, reflected through mirrors into what feels like an endless field of stars, while a recording reads through the names for approximately 3 months on a loop before starting over. So, when people say the children of Bergen-Belsen never left, that's true in 2 completely different ways at once. Some never left because the camp killed them before the British arrived, or in the chaos of the weeks after, sometimes through the very food meant to save them. Others never left in a different sense. Even after the gates opened and the war ended, There was simply nowhere else in the world willing to take them in. So they stayed on that same patch of land for years, got married there, and had children of their own there. Both versions belong to the same 1.5 million children the Nazis tried to erase from history, and to the smaller number who survived long enough to prove they couldn't. Their names deserve to be remembered, not just their numbers. Subscribe for more stories like this.